For 12 years, Marcus Johnson arrived before sunrise and left long after the city had gone dark. He built luxury towers, glass office complexes, and entire neighborhoods with his own two hands. Yet not one executive walking past the construction gates could tell you his name. He carried steel beams across narrow scaffolds in the freezing months of January, and in the suffocating heat of July, he was the man pouring concrete while younger supervisors hid inside air-conditioned trailers. Stonebridge Development, the company that employed him, was one of the largest construction firms on the East Coast, with its name engraved on skyscrapers, hospitals, and shopping centers across 3 states. And still, inside the very walls he helped raise, Marcus Johnson remained invisible. Executives in tailored suits walked past him every single morning without so much as a glance in his direction. Managers half his age gave him orders without learning his last name. Even when the company's brand new chief executive officer, a sharp and ambitious woman named Victoria Bennett, toured the construction sites to inspect progress, her eyes swept right over him, as though he were another piece of equipment stacked along the fence line. Then, on a gray and rainy Tuesday morning in early spring, a stack of confidential documents was delivered to the wrong desk, a clerical mistake that should have taken 30 seconds to correct. Instead, it landed directly in front of Marcus Johnson, and inside that folder was a single contract requiring one final, irreplaceable signature. Nobody in that boardroom, not the directors, not the lawyers, not even Victoria Bennett herself, had any idea who that signature truly belonged to. And when Marcus finally picked up the pen that had been waiting for him for over a decade, an entire empire built on steel and glass and quiet arrogance would stop breathing all at once. Marcus Johnson was 45 years old, a broad-shouldered black man with calloused hands and a quiet, steady way of moving through the world that made people assume there was nothing more to him than what they saw in his hard hat and reflective vest. He had worked construction for Stonebridge Development for 12 straight years, longer than most of the junior executives who now ran the daily operations of the company. He was always the first man through the gates each morning, often arriving while the sky was still black and the city slept, and he was almost always the last to leave at night, checking that every piece of equipment was secured and every safety barrier was properly placed. To his co-workers, he was simply Marcus, a name spoken with casual familiarity but rarely with any real curiosity behind it. Nobody at the company knew anything about his past. They did not know where he had come from, what he had once owned, or what he had once been before he picked up a hammer and started showing up at 5 in the morning. He lived modestly in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city, the kind of place with a leaking faucet he fixed himself and a window unit that rattled all summer long. He drove an old pickup truck, with rust creeping along its wheel wells, and he packed the same turkey sandwich in a paper bag nearly every single day of the week. Despite the quiet plainness of his life, Marcus was known among the crew for something far more valuable than wealth or title: a deep and unwavering willingness to help anyone who needed it. When a younger worker named Tyrese struggled to read a blueprint correctly, Marcus would pull him aside during the lunch break and patiently walk him through every measurement until it made sense. When an older laborer named Frank injured his back lifting a load improperly, Marcus carried half the man's workload for 2 full weeks without ever mentioning it to a supervisor. He never asked for recognition, and he never seemed to expect any, which was perhaps the very reason nobody around him ever thought to look closer. Beneath the surface of Stonebridge Development, however, a quieter and far more painful kind of discrimination simmered every single day, the kind that does not announce itself with cruelty, but instead wears the mask of simple carelessness. Young managers fresh out of business school, men with expensive watches and little real experience on an actual job site, would walk past the construction crews with thinly veiled disdain, treating the laborers as interchangeable parts rather than human beings. Marcus was routinely left out of safety meetings that directly concerned the work he was doing, his concerns about structural shortcuts dismissed before he could even finish a sentence. Time and time again, his ideas for improving efficiency on the site were quietly stolen by ambitious young supervisors who repeated his exact suggestions in front of regional directors and accepted the praise as though the thought had been their own. It was a small, grinding kind of injustice, the sort that wears a man down slowly rather than all at once. Yet Marcus absorbed it with a patience that baffled the few people who ever bothered to notice it at all. Then came Victoria Bennett, the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of Stonebridge Development, a 38-year-old woman who had clawed her way up through finance and corporate strategy before the board of directors handed her the keys to the entire company. She was widely regarded as one of the sharpest minds in the industry, capable of dissecting a balance sheet faster than anyone in the room and ruthless when negotiating contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Colleagues respected her intelligence, but few described her as warm, and fewer still described her as approachable, since her reputation was built almost entirely on cold, calculated competence rather than personal connection. When she made her first official tour of the company's flagship construction site, a gleaming 40-story tower rising in the heart of downtown, she walked the perimeter with a tablet in hand, scanning numbers and timelines rather than faces. She passed directly by Marcus Johnson that morning, so close that the hem of her coat nearly brushed against his shoulder, and she did not look at him even once. Marcus, for his part, simply offered the faintest smile, the kind a man gives when he has long since stopped expecting to be seen, and then returned his attention to the steel beam he was securing into place. He had learned, over 12 long years, that being overlooked was not the same thing as being unimportant, and he carried that quiet wisdom with him the way other men carried tools in their belt. Neither Victoria nor anyone else in that boardroom that day had any idea that the very fate of the company they all served would soon rest entirely in the rough, steady hands of the man they had just walked past without a second glance. 12 years earlier, Stonebridge Development had stood on the very edge of total collapse, its name nearly erased from the industry forever by a string of failed investments and a banking crisis that swallowed smaller firms whole within months. The company's founders had watched helplessly as creditors circled and employees began quietly searching for other jobs, certain that the doors would close before the year was out. Then, almost overnight, an emergency infusion of capital arrived from a mysterious private investor, a deal negotiated in such secrecy that even most of the senior staff at the time never learned the donor's true identity. The company survived, jobs were saved, and Stonebridge Development rebuilt itself from the ashes of near bankruptcy into one of the most formidable construction firms on the entire East Coast. What almost nobody inside the company understood was that the identity of that anonymous investor had been deliberately buried beneath layers of legal language and non-disclosure agreements, so thick that only a small handful of attorneys had ever seen the original paperwork. Among those attorneys was a quiet, meticulous man named Robert Hale, a lawyer in his early 60s with silver hair and the unhurried demeanor of someone who had spent decades keeping other people's secrets. Robert had been present in the room the day the rescue deal was signed, and in all the years since, he had remained the one constant thread connecting the company's hidden past to its very public present. He alone understood the full weight of what had been agreed upon that day, and he alone understood why one particular clause buried deep within the contract mattered more than anyone at Stonebridge Development could possibly imagine. For years, Marcus would occasionally receive a brief private phone call during his lunch break, always from the same unlisted number, always from Robert Hale himself. The conversations were short and low-key, usually nothing more than Robert confirming that Marcus was well and reminding him, gently but firmly, that certain rights belonging to him remained fully intact, regardless of how much time had passed. During one such call, standing near the back of a half-finished parking structure with a sandwich in one hand, Marcus listened as Robert said quietly, "Don't forget, your rights are still exactly where we left them," a sentence that meant absolutely nothing to anyone who might have overheard it, yet carried the entire weight of an empire within its simple words. Marcus would usually respond with little more than a thank you and a request that Robert not worry about him so much, since money had never been the thing that motivated him in the first place. What truly mattered to Marcus, far more than wealth or recognition, was simply that the company kept its doors open and kept paying the people who depended on it for their livelihoods. He had seen what it meant for a workforce to lose everything overnight, and he had no interest in ever watching that happen again to people who reminded him so much of who he once was. As the months passed and the company continued growing under new leadership, the board of directors began quietly discussing the possibility of selling off a significant portion of the company's assets to a larger national competitor, a move that promised enormous short-term profit for shareholders. Buried within the original rescue agreement from 12 years earlier, however, was a single secret clause that nobody currently sitting on that board had ever bothered to read closely, a clause that was about to become the single most important sentence in the entire history of Stonebridge development. It did not take long before Victoria Bennett discovered just how fragile the company's foundation truly was beneath its impressive skyline of finished towers and glowing press releases. The flagship downtown project, the very tower Marcus had been helping construct for the better part of 2 years, was suddenly threatened by a financial shortfall so severe that the lead bank backing the development demanded an immediate and aggressive restructuring of the entire loan. Victoria spent sleepless nights buried in spreadsheets, tracing every dollar that had been spent and every dollar still owed, searching desperately for a path that would not end in disaster. The pressure from the bank was only the beginning, however, since several members of the board of directors saw the crisis not as a problem to solve, but as an opportunity to finally push through their long-desired plan of selling off major assets. These board members, led quietly by a slick and self-assured executive named Eric Dawson, argued forcefully in closed-door meetings that liquidating key properties was the only responsible path forward, regardless of how many jobs it might cost along the way. If the sale went through as Eric and his allies envisioned, thousands of employees across multiple construction sites, including every single member of Marcus's own crew, stood to lose their jobs within a matter of months. Victoria found herself fighting on two fronts at once, struggling against a hostile banking partner on one side, while simultaneously battling members of her own board who seemed far more interested in protecting their personal financial stakes than in protecting the people who actually built the company's success. She worked 18-hour days for weeks on end, fueled by black coffee and a stubborn refusal to let a company she had only just inherited collapse under her watch, even as exhaustion carved deep shadows beneath her eyes. During one of her increasingly frequent site visits, intended to personally assess which projects might survive a potential sale, Victoria found herself observing the construction crews with a new and unexpected attentiveness. She noticed, almost by accident, the quiet, methodical way certain workers carried themselves, men and women who showed up early, worked without complaint, and seemed to genuinely care about the integrity of what they were building, rather than simply collecting a paycheck. Marcus Johnson, in particular, caught her attention one afternoon when she watched him patiently re-explain a safety procedure to a nervous new hire, his voice calm and encouraging, even though the temperature outside was nearly unbearable. For the first time since taking over the company, Victoria began to feel something shift inside her chest, a dawning and uncomfortable realization that the people she had been treating as interchangeable line items on a budget report were, in fact, the very heartbeat of everything Stonebridge Development had ever built. It was during this period of mounting crisis that Robert Hale finally requested an urgent meeting with Victoria Bennett, arriving at her office with a leather folder tucked firmly under one arm and an expression far more serious than his usual calm demeanor. He informed her, in careful and deliberate language, that any sale of major company assets would require the explicit written approval of someone he described only as the holder of final veto power, a phrase Victoria had genuinely never encountered in any of the company's documentation she had reviewed so far. She pressed him for a name, but Robert simply explained that the identity of this individual was protected under a confidentiality agreement that even he was not yet authorized to break, leaving Victoria staring at him with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. As Robert left her office that evening, he paused at the door and added quietly that the situation would resolve itself soon enough, though he offered no further explanation of what exactly that meant. News of this mysterious veto power spread quickly through the upper ranks of Stonebridge Development, igniting a quiet but feverish search among executives and board members, desperate to identify the unknown figure who apparently controlled the company's fate. Wild theories began circulating almost immediately within the marble hallways of corporate headquarters, each one more elaborate than the last. as ambitious minds tried to make sense of a mystery nobody could solve. Some executives whispered that the hidden stakeholder must be a reclusive foreign billionaire, perhaps someone from overseas who preferred to operate entirely behind the scenes while quietly accumulating influence over American construction firms. Others insisted the answer had to be far more mundane, perhaps nothing more than an obscure investment fund whose lawyers had simply buried a standard veto clause inside the original rescue contract 12 years earlier, without anyone realizing its eventual significance. Victoria herself launched a private investigation, instructing her personal assistant to dig through old financial records and outdated filing systems in search of any name connected to the original rescue agreement. The deeper her search went, however, the less she found, since every document trail seemed to dissolve into dead ends, sealed files, and redacted names that led nowhere conclusive. Meanwhile, completely unaware of the storm of speculation swirling through the executive offices above him, Marcus Johnson continued showing up to the construction site at the very same hour, every single morning, mixing concrete by hand when the machine broke down, inspecting delivered steel for hairline defects before it was ever installed, and patiently training the newest members of the crew on proper safety procedures. He moved through his days with the same quiet rhythm he always had, utterly disconnected from the chaos unfolding in the polished offices several miles away. It was during this frantic search that one of Victoria's assistants stumbled upon a handful of decades-old internal memos referencing nothing more than the initials M.J. attached to a financial account. Nobody in the place's current finance department recognized. The discovery sparked a brief flurry of excitement, since it represented the very first concrete lead anyone had uncovered, yet without a full name or any additional context. The initials proved frustratingly impossible to trace any further. Victoria stared at those two letters for a long while that evening, turning them over in her mind, without any real sense of what they might mean, completely unaware that the answer to the entire mystery had been pouring concrete less than a mile away from her office for over a decade. As pressure from the bank intensified and the board grew increasingly impatient for a resolution, an emergency executive meeting was finally scheduled, one that would set in motion the very chain of events nobody at Stonebridge Development could have possibly predicted. Eric Dawson had risen through the ranks of Stonebridge Development through a combination of genuine ambition and an almost effortless talent for charming senior executives while treating everyone beneath him with thinly disguised contempt. He wore expensive suits that fit him a little too perfectly, spoke in the clipped, confident tones of someone who had never once doubted his own judgment, and routinely referred to construction laborers as the field staff in a tone that made the distinction sound almost insulting. On the same downtown tower project, where Marcus had worked tirelessly for nearly 2 years, Eric had recently been placed in charge of overseeing the final stages of construction, a role that gave him direct authority over the very crew that had built the project from its foundation upward. It did not take long before tensions between Eric and Marcus began to surface, since the two men approached their work with fundamentally different philosophies about what truly mattered on a job site. During a routine inspection one humid afternoon, Marcus noticed a troubling irregularity in the support beams being installed on the building's 22nd floor, a subtle misalignment that experienced eyes could detect, but that might easily be missed by someone less familiar with structural work. He approached Eric directly, explaining as clearly and respectfully as he could that the beams needed to be reinforced before construction proceeded any further, since the current configuration posed a genuine risk to the building's long-term structural integrity. Eric, eager to keep the project on schedule and unwilling to entertain what he viewed as an unnecessary delay suggested by a mere laborer, dismissed the warning outright, insisting that Marcus was overstating a minor issue that the engineering team had already approved. Marcus pressed the matter once more, calmly but firmly, only to be told in clipped, irritated words that his job was to follow instructions, not to second-guess decisions made by people with actual engineering credentials. 3 days later, exactly as Marcus had feared, a section of scaffolding connected to those very same beams began to shift dangerously during a routine concrete pour, sending a tremor of panic through the workers' station nearby. Marcus, who had quietly continued monitoring the structure despite being overruled, was the first to notice the shift and immediately ordered every worker in the vicinity to evacuate the area, his voice carrying an authority that overrode any official chain of command in that critical moment. Disaster was narrowly avoided that afternoon, with the site sustaining only minor equipment damage rather than the catastrophic collapse that could easily have claimed lives, a fact that became immediately and painfully obvious to every worker who had witnessed how close they had come to tragedy. Rather than expressing gratitude or acknowledging the very real danger Marcus had helped prevent, Eric Dawson instead chose to publicly humiliate him in front of the entire assembled crew, his voice rising with anger and embarrassment over having been proven wrong. Eric accused Marcus of overstepping his role and creating unnecessary panic among the workforce, declaring loudly that Marcus was, in his exact words, nothing more than ordinary labor who had no business questioning decisions made above his pay grade. The words landed hard among the assembled crew, many of whom exchanged uncomfortable glances, yet Marcus simply absorbed the insult with the same quiet composure he had carried through 12 long years of being overlooked and underestimated. As it happened, Victoria Bennett was touring the site that very same afternoon, arriving just in time to witness the tail end of Eric's outburst, though she lacked the full context of what had actually transpired moments before. She noted privately that Eric's behavior struck her as needlessly harsh, yet without understanding the structural warning Marcus had correctly identified, she filed the incident away as little more than ordinary workplace friction rather than the significant moment it truly represented. That same evening, as Marcus drove home in his rusting pickup truck with the radio playing low, his phone rang with the familiar unlisted number belonging to Robert Hale. The lawyer's voice carried a gravity Marcus had rarely heard from him before, a seriousness that immediately told him this call was unlike any of the brief check-ins they had shared over the years. "It's time," Robert said simply, offering no further elaboration in that moment, yet the weight behind those 3 words settled into Marcus's chest like a stone dropped into still water. Marcus sat quietly in his parked truck outside his apartment building for several long minutes after the call ended, staring out at the darkening sky, fully aware that whatever was coming would change everything he had carefully kept hidden for over a decade. The very next morning, a junior administrative assistant named Hannah, overwhelmed by an enormous backlog of paperwork following the recent banking crisis, made a simple clerical error that would ultimately set the entire chain of events into motion. Intending to deliver a stack of confidential merger documents to the regional finance director, Hannah instead misread a similarly worded name on her delivery list and dropped the sealed folder directly onto Marcus Johnson's small, battered work locker near the site office. Marcus, noticing the folder sitting unattended where his lunch bag usually rested, assumed at first that it had been left there by mistake and intended simply to return it to the front office during his next break. Curiosity, however, got the better of him when he noticed his own initials handwritten faintly in pencil on the folder's corner, a detail so unusual that he found himself opening the cover before he had even fully decided to do so. Inside, Marcus discovered detailed plans for the sale of a substantial portion of Stonebridge Development's assets to a much larger national construction conglomerate, a deal structured to close within a matter of weeks if it received final approval. As he read further, his stomach tightened with a familiar, sickening dread, since the documents made unmistakably clear that thousands of jobs across multiple construction sites, including every single member of his own crew, would be eliminated almost immediately should the sale proceed as planned. Buried near the final pages of the contract, in dense legal language that most readers would likely skim past without a second thought, was a clause requiring the signature of a designated special shareholder before any sale could legally take effect. Marcus read that particular clause 3 full times, his hands growing unsteady, because he understood with sudden and total clarity exactly whose signature the document was describing. For a long moment, sitting alone in the quiet construction trailer, with rain tapping gently against the window, Marcus genuinely considered simply returning the folder to the front office and saying nothing at all about what he had seen. He had spent 12 years deliberately avoiding the spotlight, content to let his ownership stake remain a quiet, private matter, known only to himself and Robert Hale, never once using it to seek attention or special treatment. But as he thought of Tyrese, the young worker he had personally trained to read blueprints, and of Frank, the older laborer whose injured back he had quietly covered for, and of dozens of other families whose entire livelihoods depended on Stonebridge development remaining intact, Marcus understood that silence was no longer an option he could responsibly choose. He picked up his phone, dialed the familiar unlisted number, and told Robert Hale that he was finally ready to step into the room everyone had spent weeks searching for. The emergency board meeting convened on a bright Thursday morning in the company's largest conference room, a space dominated by a long mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the very skyline Marcus had spent over a decade helping to build. Victoria Bennett sat at the head of the table, flanked by nervous financial advisors and increasingly impatient board members, while Eric Dawson occupied a seat near the center, radiating his usual confident self-assurance. The mood in the room shifted instantly the moment the heavy glass doors opened, and Marcus Johnson stepped inside, still dressed in his work boots, reflective vest, and a hard hat he had forgotten to remove in his haste, having come directly from the construction site at Robert's specific instruction. A startled security guard moved quickly to intercept him, assuming a mistake had occurred, while several board members exchanged confused glances at the sight of a construction worker standing uninvited in their most important meeting of the year. Eric Dawson let out a short, dismissive laugh, leaning back in his leather chair as he announced loudly that the man had clearly wandered into the wrong floor of the building entirely. A ripple of quiet, condescending amusement passed around portions of the table, several executives smirking openly as they watched Marcus stand there in his work clothes, utterly out of place among the tailored suits and polished shoes. Victoria, growing visibly irritated by what she assumed was either a serious security failure or an inappropriate prank orchestrated by someone trying to disrupt an already stressful meeting, opened her mouth to demand an explanation for the interruption. Before she could speak, the heavy glass doors opened once more, and Robert Hale walked calmly into the room. A thick leather folder clutched firmly beneath one arm and an expression of absolute, unwavering seriousness etched across his face. He moved to stand directly beside Marcus, placing a steady hand briefly on the construction worker's shoulder, a gesture that silenced the room far more effectively than any words could have managed in that moment. Robert looked slowly around the table, meeting the eyes of every executive who had spent weeks searching desperately for the identity of the company's mysterious hidden stakeholder, and then he spoke the words that would change the course of Stonebridge development forever. "The man you have all been laughing at," he said, his voice steady and unhurried, "is the very person holding the final decision over everything happening in this room." The silence that followed felt almost physical, pressing down on every person seated at that long mahogany table, as Robert Hale opened his leather folder and began explaining a story that none of them, save for himself, had ever fully understood. 12 years earlier, he explained, before Marcus Johnson had ever swung a hammer for Stonebridge development, he had been the sole owner of a modest but profitable regional construction supply business that he had built from absolutely nothing over the course of nearly 2 decades. When the financial crisis struck and threatened to swallow Stonebridge development entirely, Marcus had made the extraordinary decision to liquidate his entire company, every asset, every contract, every dollar he had ever earned, in order to provide the emergency capital infusion that ultimately saved the firm from total collapse. In exchange for sacrificing everything he had spent his life building, Marcus had negotiated a single, carefully worded condition buried deep within the rescue agreement, a special class of preferred shares, granting him permanent veto authority over any future sale or dissolution of major company assets. He had chosen, deliberately and quietly, to remain anonymous afterward, walking away from the negotiating table not with a corner office or an executive title, but with a simple, almost unthinkable request to be hired as an ordinary construction worker on the very projects his sacrifice had made possible. Robert explained that Marcus had wanted, more than anything else, to understand firsthand whether the company he had saved would actually treat its workers with the dignity and respect they deserved, a question that could never truly be answered from behind a desk in a corner office. Around the table, faces shifted from confusion to disbelief to something approaching genuine horror as the weight of 12 years of accumulated condescension and casual disrespect came crashing down upon every executive who had ever dismissed Marcus. Without a second thought, Eric Dawson's face drained of all color as the memory of his own cruel words on the construction site replayed itself in his mind, the realization settling over him that the man he had publicly humiliated as nothing more than ordinary labor held the literal power to dissolve the very deal he had spent months championing. Several board members stared down at the table, unable to meet Marcus's eyes, while others shifted uncomfortably in their expensive chairs, suddenly acutely aware of every dismissive comment they had ever made about the construction crews who built their towers. Victoria Bennett sat frozen at the head of the table, her sharp, analytical mind struggling to reconcile the quiet, unassuming man she had walked past without a glance just weeks earlier with the extraordinary figure Robert Hale was now describing in careful, measured detail. For perhaps the first time since taking over as chief executive officer, Victoria found herself utterly speechless, staring at Marcus Johnson with something far more complicated than simple surprise. Robert finally placed the contract on the table directly in front of Marcus, sliding a pen across the polished wood toward him, the same pen that would either approve or permanently block the sale that had consumed the entire executive leadership team for weeks on end. Every single person seated at that table leaned forward almost involuntarily, their eyes fixed on the construction worker's calloused hand as he reached out and picked up the pen with the same quiet steadiness he brought to every task on the job site. The room held its breath collectively, executives and board members alike, suddenly desperate for an outcome they had spent weeks trying to force through committee votes and closed-door negotiations, now reduced to waiting on the decision of a single man in a hard hat. Marcus studied the document in front of him for a long, deliberate moment, his eyes scanning the carefully worded clauses one final time, before he set the pen down firmly on the table without signing a single line. "I'm not signing this," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying none of the anger or vindication the room might have expected, only a calm and unwavering certainty that immediately commanded everyone's full attention. He explained, in plain and unhurried language, that he had no intention of allowing thousands of hard-working employees to lose their livelihoods, simply to satisfy short-term shareholder profits that would ultimately benefit only a handful of people already seated comfortably around that very table. Instead, Marcus laid out a series of conditions that would need to be met before he would even consider supporting any future restructuring of the company. Conditions born not from corporate strategy, but from 12 years of first-hand experience, standing on the very ground he was now defending. He insisted, first and foremost, that no employee currently working at any Stonebridge development site be terminated as a result of the proposed financial restructuring, regardless of how the company's broader strategy ultimately evolved moving forward. He demanded a complete overhaul of safety standards across every active construction site, citing the near catastrophe he had personally prevented just days earlier as undeniable proof that current protocols left far too much room for preventable tragedy. Marcus further insisted upon the creation of a genuine, fully funded vocational training program, one that would give workers like Tyrese real pathways toward advancement, rather than leaving them permanently trapped in entry-level positions regardless of their skill or dedication. He called for a transparent and merit-based promotion system, free from the kind of favoritism and credential snobbery that had allowed men like Eric Dawson to rise quickly while overlooking the genuine expertise of people who actually understood the work. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, Marcus demanded that the company establish a formal channel through which frontline workers could communicate safety concerns and operational suggestions directly to senior leadership rather than watching their ideas disappear into the void or get stolen by ambitious managers seeking personal credit. Victoria Bennett, listening intently to every word with an expression of growing and genuine respect, agreed to each condition without hesitation, recognizing immediately that Marcus was articulating something far more valuable than any financial spreadsheet had ever managed to reveal to her. For the very first time, Since assuming leadership of Stonebridge Development, she understood with complete clarity that the true value of her company had never resided in its glass towers or its impressive balance sheets, but in the dignity and expertise of the people who built everything from the ground up. In the days that followed, an internal investigation was quietly launched into Eric Dawson's conduct, uncovering a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond his public humiliation of Marcus on the construction site. Multiple employees came forward with accounts of Eric taking credit for ideas that were not his own, dismissing legitimate safety concerns to protect project timelines, and creating a toxic culture of fear among workers too intimidated to challenge his authority. Word of the boardroom confrontation spread quickly through every level of Stonebridge Development, traveling from construction sites to corporate offices within a matter of days, carried by workers who could hardly believe the story themselves, even as they repeated it. Many employees who had worked alongside Marcus for years without ever suspecting his true history found themselves overwhelmed with emotion upon learning what he had quietly sacrificed to save the very company that employed them. Tyrese, upon hearing the full story from a coworker during a lunch break, sat in stunned silence for several minutes before finally walking over to find Marcus and simply thanking him, not just for the patient blueprint lessons, but for everything Marcus had apparently done long before either of them had ever met. Despite the sudden flood of attention and respect now directed his way, Marcus continued showing up to the construction site at the very same early hour each morning, still wearing the same worn work boots, still checking the same safety equipment, utterly unchanged by the revelation that had upended the company around him. It was perhaps this very humility, this refusal to let newfound recognition alter who he fundamentally was, that left Victoria Bennett wanting to understand him more deeply than any boardroom explanation could possibly provide. Several days after the confrontation that had upended the entire company, Victoria requested a private meeting with Marcus, choosing not the formal surroundings of her executive office, but instead the quiet, unfinished interior of the downtown tower they had both, in their own very different ways, helped to build. She arrived in simple clothing rather than her usual tailored business attire, finding Marcus exactly where she expected him to be, carefully inspecting a section of reinforced flooring with the same patient attention he brought to every task. "Why did you spend 12 years working construction?" Victoria asked him directly, settling onto an overturned crate near where he knelt, "when you could have simply collected dividends from your shares and never set foot on a job site at all?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering, setting down his measuring tape and looking out at the city skyline, visible through the building's still unfinished windows. He explained that he had wanted, more than anything else, to truly understand the people who actually created value within a company, the laborers and tradespeople whose names rarely appeared on any annual report yet, whose skill and sacrifice made every single profit margin possible. He told her that he had watched too many companies throughout his life treat their workers as disposable resources, easily replaced and easily forgotten, and he had refused to let Stonebridge Development become another faceless name on that growing list. By working alongside the very people his sacrifice had protected, Marcus explained, he could see with his own eyes whether the company was actually honoring the spirit of what he had given up everything to save, rather than simply trusting reassurances from executives who had never once set foot on an active construction site. Victoria listened in near silence, feeling something shift uncomfortably within her own understanding of leadership, since she had spent her entire career believing that strategic vision from the top mattered far more than any insight available from the ground. She found herself, in that quiet, unfinished room, confronting an uncomfortable truth about her own leadership style, recognizing that she had walked past hundreds of workers exactly like Marcus without ever once pausing to ask what they actually knew about the company she had been entrusted to run. In the weeks that followed that conversation, Victoria began a quiet but genuine transformation in how she approached her role as Chief Executive Officer, scheduling regular visits to construction sites, not as brief photo opportunities, but as serious listening sessions with the people actually doing the work. She and Marcus found themselves collaborating increasingly often, Victoria drawing on his decades of first-hand experience while he offered her a perspective no business degree could ever have taught, and together they began reshaping the very culture of Stonebridge Development from the inside out. Working conditions across the company's construction sites improved steadily and visibly over the following months, as the vocational training program Marcus had demanded took shape under careful supervision, giving workers like Tyrese genuine pathways towards supervisory roles they had never before believed possible. Safety incidents declined sharply as new protocols took hold. Born directly from the near disaster Marcus had personally prevented and the years of frontline experience he brought to every policy discussion. Employees across every level of the organization began reporting a markedly different atmosphere within the company, one where ideas from the construction floor were genuinely heard rather than dismissed or stolen by ambitious managers seeking personal credit. Eric Dawson, facing the mounting weight of the internal investigation into his conduct alongside the undeniable shift in company culture happening all around him, ultimately chose to resign from Stonebridge Development entirely, a quiet and almost anticlimactic departure for a man who had once seemed so thoroughly untouchable. His exit, though largely unceremonious, came to represent something far larger within the company, a symbolic closing of the chapter defined by careless condescension toward the very people who built everything Stonebridge Development had ever achieved. Exactly 1 year after the chaotic boardroom meeting that had upended the company's entire leadership structure, the downtown tower that Marcus had spent so many years constructing finally stood complete, its glass exterior catching the late afternoon sun as thousands of employees gathered for the building's official opening ceremony. Victoria Bennett stood before a massive crowd assembled at the base of the tower, construction workers in hard hats standing shoulder to shoulder with executives in business attire, a sight that would have seemed almost impossible just 12 months earlier. She spoke without notes that afternoon, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd as she described the journey the company had undergone over the past year, a journey that had fundamentally changed how she understood leadership and value within an organization. "The most important person standing here today is not me," she told the crowd. Pausing briefly as her words settled over the silent gathering, "The most important people here are the ones who actually build everything we see around us." A wave of quiet, emotional energy rippled through the crowd at those words, many workers exchanging glances of disbelief at hearing such a sentiment spoken openly and publicly by the company's chief executive officer. Victoria then extended her hand toward the edge of the crowd, calling Marcus Johnson forward to join her on the small, elevated stage, watching as he hesitated for a brief moment before finally stepping forward in his familiar work boots and vest. The entire assembled crowd rose to their feet almost as one, applause thundering across the plaza as Marcus stood beside Victoria at the base of the very tower his sacrifice had ultimately helped make possible. His expression, a quiet mixture of humility and something that finally, after 12 long years, resembled genuine recognition. Tyrese stood near the front of the crowd, clapping with tears visible in his eyes, while Frank, his back fully healed, stood beside him, cheering as loudly as his voice would allow. For Marcus Johnson, the moment represented something he had genuinely never sought out for himself, yet one that finally acknowledged the quiet, persistent dignity he had carried through every single day of being overlooked. For Victoria Bennett, standing beside him on that stage, the moment represented the discovery of something far more valuable than any merger or acquisition could ever provide: a genuine partner who understood the true foundation upon which every successful company is actually built. Stonebridge Development entered a new chapter that day, one defined not by cold financial calculations or boardroom maneuvering, but by a fundamental and lasting respect for the people whose hands and labor made every single achievement possible in the first place. And all of it, every reformed safety protocol, every new training program, every transformed relationship between workers and executives, had begun with a single misplaced folder and one quiet, unassuming man who finally decided that 12 years of silence was enough.